I am 48 years old, and until last Christmas, I believed the worst thing that could happen to a marriage was an affair, a hidden debt, or one person slowly deciding that the other no longer mattered. But I learned that a family can be dismantled more efficiently by someone who never sleeps in your bed, never signs your tax return, and still understands exactly which fear to press until two people who once trusted each other begin treating every conversation like an accusation. My mother-in-law, Judith, did not simply lie about having cancer because a lie that large cannot survive on one sentence. So she built an entire second life around it, complete with hospital folders, treatment calendars, pharmacy bags, rides to appointments, private consultations, and carefully timed phone calls in which she sounded weak enough to make everyone panic, but never so weak that she lost control of the room. By the time I discovered the truth, my wife Emily and I had emptied most of the savings we had spent 22 years building, borrowed against the house, delayed our daughter's graduate school plans, and reached the point where Emily believed my questions about money proved that I cared more about an account balance than whether her mother lived or died. Judith had never been openly cruel, because open cruelty would have taught us to defend ourselves, while she preferred concern that carried a small wound inside it, remembering birthdays, helping with the children, praising me in public, and saving the comments that weakened my marriage for private moments when nobody else could compare what she had said. She was 67, widowed for almost a decade, comfortable on paper, but always short of money in practice because she had refinanced her townhouse, spent heavily on travel and clothes, and described each new expense as something she deserved after surviving a difficult marriage. Emily was 45, our son Luke was 20, and our daughter Sophie was 23, while I had spent most of my adult life managing operations for a regional packaging company, which is not exciting work, but had given us a steady income, decent health insurance, and enough discipline to save because I grew up in a house where one broken transmission could decide whether the electricity stayed on. Emily worked part-time as a physical therapist after years spent raising the children, a decision we had made together, although Judith later recast it as proof that I had kept her daughter dependent, just as she turned ordinary compromises into evidence that Emily had sacrificed while I collected the benefits. The first call came on a Tuesday evening in February, while I was washing dishes and Emily was sorting mail at the kitchen table, and I knew something was wrong because Emily stopped moving before she said anything, then pressed the phone tighter against her ear and asked her mother to repeat the name of the cancer. Judith said it was pancreatic cancer, advanced but not yet fully staged, and that the doctor had warned her the location made surgery difficult, which sounded specific enough to be credible while remaining vague enough that no one could ask for a simple treatment plan. Emily drove to Judith's townhouse immediately, and I followed after calling Luke and Sophie, while Judith sat on the sofa in a gray cardigan holding tissues and showed us a letter from a private oncology practice, blood results, and a scan image she said proved the cancer was advanced. She explained that she wanted a private clinic combining chemotherapy, targeted infusions, and nutritional support because she feared losing dignity in a hospital, then reacted with wounded restraint when I asked to attend the next appointment, which made Emily apologize before I could point out that the packet contained no pathology report, staging details, or signed treatment plan. During the first month, Judith refused money whenever anyone offered it, which later made sense because she needed helping to feel like our idea, then gradually introduced a private clinic 3 hours away that limited visitors, handled payments through a patient services company, and offered treatments her insurer supposedly refused to cover. Her first request for money came after she said the insurer had denied an experimental infusion, and she cried while explaining that the treatment might add a year or more, although there were no guarantees, and she hated asking us to risk our future for a chance that belonged only to her. Emily transferred $25,000 from our savings before discussing it with me, and when I discovered the withdrawal the next morning, she said she knew I would eventually agree, but could not bear wasting a day while her mother's cancer continued growing. I was angry, not because I would have refused treatment, but because the decision belonged to both of us, and the money represented Sophie's remaining graduate school fund, part of Luke's tuition, and the emergency cushion that had taken years to build. Yet when I said that, Emily heard only that I was assigning prices to people she loved. Judith apologized for causing tension, then privately told Emily that some men become controlling when illness exposes how little control they actually have, which Emily repeated to me during an argument 3 weeks later, not realizing the sentence did not sound like her. The payments grew from $25,000 to $40,000, then another $18,000 for something Judith called immune priming, followed by travel, medication, and home support, while relatives raised almost $60,000 more and reorganized birthdays, work schedules, and college weekends around her illness. I drove her to 3 appointments, but never entered the clinic because she asked me to wait nearby. And a different car always returned her several hours later without the visible effects she described later by phone. I did not distrust her because she kept her hair or appetite, since real cancer does not owe anyone a recognizable performance, but the paperwork became impossible to ignore when one invoice led to a mailbox store, another used the tax number of a dissolved wellness company, a $9,000 medication appeared nowhere in legitimate records, and the physician named on the first letter had retired almost 4 years earlier. When I brought these issues to Emily, she reacted as if I had accused her mother of murder, then told me Judith had warned her I would eventually look for technical reasons to stop paying because I had never understood the bond between a mother and daughter. That argument lasted until 2 in the morning and ended with Emily sleeping in Sophie's old room, after which Judith called me the next day to say she forgave me for being frightened, a sentence so polished and condescending that I nearly hung up. But I still did not have proof, and knew that confronting a sick woman with suspicions could destroy my marriage, even if I was wrong. Over the next 6 months, Judith learned to use uncertainty as a weapon, because whenever I asked for records, she said privacy mattered. Whenever I questioned a payment, she described a new symptom, and whenever Emily seemed ready to slow down, Judith hinted that the next month might be her last Christmas, last birthday, or last chance to repair old wounds. She also began talking to Emily about our marriage in ways that sounded supportive, but always left damage behind, reminding her that I had once resisted replacing the kitchen, that I traveled too often when the children were young, that my retirement account remained in my name, and that I had asked for a budget while her mother was supposedly dying, all of which contained enough truth to survive repetition while leaving out every context that made those choices understandable. At the end of August, while we were already sleeping badly and arguing over nearly every transfer, Emily learned that she was pregnant at 45, something neither of us had planned, and both of us were frightened to hope for because the obstetrician called it a high-risk pregnancy from the first appointment. Yet the first ultrasound showed a heartbeat, and for several days our house became quiet in a different way, as if one small future had forced us to remember that we were still a family, rather than 2 people defending separate versions of one crisis. We told Luke and Sophie first, then Judith, and instead of treating the pregnancy as a reason to reduce pressure, Judith turned it into another argument for urgency by saying the baby deserved to know its grandmother, that delaying treatment now meant Emily might spend the rest of her life believing she had chosen money over the only months they had left, and that stress would fall if I simply stopped questioning every request and allowed the family to act from love. Emily began carrying 2 fears at once, one for the child growing inside her, and another for the mother she believed was dying, while Judith called at all hours with new symptoms, asked for rides on days Emily had been told to rest, and sent photographs of medication bags whenever I raised questions, so the pregnancy that should have pulled us together became another private room Judith could enter whenever she needed, Emily frightened enough to obey. By October, Emily had moved half her clothes into the guest room and started taking calls from Judith behind a closed door, while I tried to speak carefully because every disagreement raised her blood pressure and every attempt to postpone a decision was repeated to her mother as proof that I cared more about control than either of their lives, which meant even my concern for the pregnancy could be reshaped into another accusation before the evening ended. The final financial break came when Judith claimed the cancer had spread to her liver, and the clinic offered an intensive 6-week program costing $94,000, which could begin only if she paid a deposit within 10 days. And although we no longer had that amount in savings, Emily met with a lender without telling me and applied for a home equity line using our joint income. I refused to authorize the home equity documents, not because I had stopped caring whether Judith lived, but because no legitimate clinic pressures a terminal patient to deliver a six-figure payment without pathology, itemized records, or a physician willing to speak to the family. Yet Emily heard only that I had placed one more obstacle between her mother and survival, then threw a glass into the sink hard enough to break it, and left for Judith's townhouse with Sophie that same night. 2 days later, Emily began bleeding in Judith's bathroom and went to the hospital, where an ultrasound confirmed that the pregnancy had ended at 11 weeks. And although the doctor explained that early loss is common, especially at her age, and that no honest physician could identify one argument or one stressful week as the single cause, he also documented severe exhaustion, elevated blood pressure, weight loss, and months of continuous strain that had left her body carrying more fear than rest. I arrived before dawn and sat beside her while she stared at the ceiling. But Judith reached her first emotionally because she told Emily that the miscarriage followed the fight about money, that my refusal had forced her to choose between her husband and her dying mother, and that some losses happen when a woman no longer feels safe in her own home, which was not a medical conclusion, but became the sentence Emily heard every time she looked at me during the weeks that followed. I knew I had not caused the pregnancy to end, and Emily knew on some level that medicine offered no simple verdict, yet grief does not wait for certainty before choosing a target, so I spent 3 nights alone in the house, moving between anger, shame, and the unbearable possibility that even if Judith's cancer story was false, the stress surrounding it had already taken something from us that no bank transfer, court order, or apology could return. The recording arrived on the 4th morning, not through a private investigator, a hidden camera, or some clever plan, but through an ordinary voicemail Judith accidentally left on my phone because she called at 6:18 a.m., said my name once, apparently placed the phone in her bag without disconnecting, and then spoke for almost 14 minutes to a man she believed was the only person listening. At first there was only movement, a car door, and Judith complaining about the cold. Then a man asked whether Emily had convinced me to sign the house papers, and Judith laughed in a way I had never heard during the illness, strong, irritated, and completely free of pain. She said I was still being difficult, but Emily had finally stopped defending me, then added that once the marriage broke completely, Emily would receive enough in the divorce to cover the rest of the Florida place, while the man told her not to get greedy because the family had already provided more than they expected. I recognized his voice after several seconds as Paul Mercer, a 64-year-old retired insurance broker who had attended family birthdays for years as Judith's harmless church friend, helped organize the fundraiser, and once hugged me while saying no parent should have to watch someone they love fight for life. The conversation continued, and each sentence removed another explanation I might have used to protect Emily from the truth, because Judith said there was no biopsy anyone could request, complained that creating new invoices was becoming risky, and told Paul that the supposed treatment money needed to move through his consulting company before the end of the year, so no one could connect it directly to the condominium deposit. Paul asked whether she worried Emily would discover the affair, and Judith said Emily was too busy blaming me, then added that the miscarriage had made her daughter easier to keep close because grief had destroyed whatever confidence remained in our marriage, a sentence delivered with such casual certainty that I had to stop the recording and walk outside before I could make myself continue listening. When I played the rest, Judith joked that by the time Emily understood what had happened, I would be gone. The money would be divided, and everyone would be too ashamed to admit they had been fooled by a gray cardigan, a few printed scans, and a mother who knew exactly how to turn her daughter's worst loss into another reason not to ask questions. The cruelest part was no longer the money or even the lover, but the way she discussed Emily, because she described her own daughter as easy to guide when frightened, said guilt had always worked better than anger, and admitted that she had exaggerated old complaints about our marriage because a united couple would eventually compare records and stop paying. I saved the voicemail to 2 computers, emailed myself a copy, and drove to Martin Shaw, an attorney who had handled a contract dispute for my company, after which he preserved the metadata, sent the audio for forensic review, contacted a detective in financial crimes, and told me to gather statements, invoices, fundraiser records, and medical paperwork without confronting anyone. Over the next 10 days, outrage turned into administrative work, as every accusation had to become an account number, transfer date, signature, or document that could survive outside our family. The practice named on Judith's original letter confirmed through counsel that she had never been a patient there, while the retired oncologist stated that the letter format and signature were not his, and the private clinic address led to a virtual office connected to a company Paul had registered under his nephew's name. Our bank records showed $127,000 leaving joint accounts, another $48,000 from relatives, and at least $31,000 from the public fundraiser, while additional cash gifts were impossible to trace and may have pushed the total well above $200,000. Some payments went to Paul's consulting company, some paid Judith's personal credit cards, and nearly $70,000 became part of a deposit on a condominium near Sarasota titled through an LLC owned equally by Judith and Paul. The affair was not new either, because hotel charges, old emails, and travel photographs showed that they had been together for at least 6 years, including during a period when Judith repeatedly told Emily she remained alone because no relationship could compare with the love she had shared with Emily's late father. I wanted to tell Emily immediately, but Martin warned that Judith and Paul could move money, destroy devices, or create a new story before investigators secured records, so I agreed to wait until the detective decided whether the evidence supported search warrants and account freezes. While the detective and Martin worked through the records, Judith kept pressing Emily about the $94,000 program, and because she knew I had refused the home equity line, she sent me a message saying that if I truly cared about my wife after the miscarriage, I would find another way to pay for the final treatment, rather than force Emily to carry one more death on her conscience. That message made something cold settle inside me, and although I did not answer from anger alone, I did decide that Judith should finally experience the kind of obligation she had been placing on everyone else. So I asked Martin whether a legitimate lender could finance the treatment directly in Judith's name if she gave written authorization, and he warned me that I could not forge, conceal required disclosures or use her identity without consent, but that nothing prevented her from borrowing for her own supposed care if she knowingly signed the application. I told Judith I had found a medical financing company willing to release $92,000 quickly, then sent her the application and said the lender needed her information, income records, electronic signature, and permission to verify her identity, while she assumed I would guarantee the balance because I told her only that I had found a way to make the money available and never corrected the story she wanted to believe. She signed every disclosure within an hour, ignored the page identifying her as the sole borrower, and called Emily crying with relief, after which the lender verified Judith by phone, deposited the proceeds into an account she designated, and began a repayment schedule that required the first monthly payment 30 days later, all of which was legal on paper because Judith had signed, even though I knew the silence surrounding who carried the debt was deliberate and morally ugly. The money disappeared in less than 2 weeks, with part moving to Paul's consulting company, part paying Judith's credit cards, and the rest increasing the Florida condominium deposit, while Judith continued telling relatives that the funds had gone toward infusions, laboratory work, and a private nurse who did not exist. When the first payment came due, the bank began calling Judith, first politely and then several times a day, asking when she intended to service the loan she had taken for her treatment, and she called me furious because she believed I had promised to handle it, while I told her the lender had approved her application, sent the money to her account, and expected the borrower named on the agreement to repay it. She said I had trapped her, and I answered that she had signed every document and spent every dollar, which did not make me proud, but did make her panic in a way I had never heard during the cancer story, because for the first time, the financial pressure was attached to her name instead of ours, and the bank could not be persuaded by tears, family guilt, or a new symptom. Martin was not pleased when I told him what I had done, even though the paperwork was valid, because he said revenge that creates new financial entanglements can complicate a clean fraud case. But he also confirmed that Judith had received full disclosures, passed identity verification, and directed the funds herself, which meant the debt would remain part of her own financial collapse, rather than becoming another obligation hidden inside my marriage. Waiting nearly destroyed what remained of me, because Emily called only to discuss separation and the miscarriage. Luke stopped answering regularly. Sophie sent short messages saying she loved me, but could not understand why I had become so hard. And Judith announced that she wanted one final Christmas dinner before beginning the intensive treatment she claimed the $92,000 loan had still not fully covered. The dinner was supposed to happen at Judith's townhouse with 14 relatives, including Paul, who had been invited as the loyal friend helping her through illness, and Judith planned to use the evening to announce that several anonymous donors had offered matching funds if the family could raise the remaining balance by New Year's Eve, while the bank continued calling her about a loan she had already emptied. The detective originally wanted us to avoid a confrontation, but by then Martin had obtained enough records for emergency civil freezes, the Financial Crimes Unit had interviewed the retired doctor, and Paul's consulting account had been linked directly to the condominium, so they agreed that I could reveal the recording as long as I did not threaten anyone, interfere with the evidence, or present myself as acting on behalf of the police. I asked whether officers would be there, and the detective said 2 would remain nearby because Judith had already been notified by one bank that a transfer was under review and by another that her first loan payment was overdue, which increased the chance that she or Paul might attempt to leave with records, devices, or whatever money remained. Emily did not know I had the voicemail or that Judith was legally responsible for the final loan, and I still question whether keeping both facts from her was fair because she was my wife and deserved the truth privately. But by then, she had shared every concern I raised with Judith, deleted 2 emails at her mother's request, and told me she would not listen to another accusation unless I had proof strong enough to say in front of the whole family. Christmas arrived with the kind of cold rain that makes every light inside a house look warmer than it is, and I stood on Judith's porch holding a small wrapped speaker and a folder of bank records while wondering whether I was about to save my marriage, end it permanently, or simply turn one family's worst year into the story everyone would repeat at every holiday after we were dead. Judith opened the door wearing a cream sweater and a silk scarf tied around her head, even though she had never lost her hair, then gave me a weak smile and said she was glad I had chosen compassion, while her phone vibrated twice on the entry table with the name of the medical lender she had been avoiding, and Paul appeared behind her carrying wine, with the solemn expression of a man who believed he had already won. Emily was in the kitchen, exhausted, grieving, and thinner than she had been in February, and when she saw me, she asked whether I had come to apologize for making the final weeks of her mother's life harder and for leaving her alone after the miscarriage, which made me realize how completely Judith had shaped the story while I was gathering proof. I told her I had come to listen first, and the family sat around 2 tables pushed together, while Judith gave a long speech about mortality, forgiveness, and the painful truth that some people reveal their real priorities only when asked to sacrifice. She did not say my name, but she looked directly at me when she described how financial fear can make love conditional, while several relatives avoided my eyes, and Paul rested one hand on the back of her chair with the ease of someone who had practiced appearing supportive. After dinner, Judith brought out a folder containing pledge forms, explained the matching donation, and said she needed to know who was willing to stand with her before treatment began in January, even though she had already received the $92,000 from the financing account and had not made the first payment, at which point Emily reached for a pen. I placed my hand over the form and asked Judith why the clinic needed more money after spending the full loan. And when she said the financing belonged to me and should not concern the family, I opened a copy of the agreement showing her signature, her bank account, and her name as the sole borrower, then explained that the calls she had been avoiding came from a bank expecting her to repay money she had personally requested and already spent. Judith stared at the pages, then accused me of setting a trap, while I told her I had not forged a signature, hidden a disclosure, or directed a single dollar because she had signed the application, passed the lender's verification, chosen the account, and moved the proceeds herself, which left the room uncertain whether I had protected my family or simply learned to use the same kind of silence she had used against us. Emily looked at me with shock, but before she could ask what else I had hidden, I asked Judith to explain the treatment one more time, including the doctor's name, clinic address, medication schedule, and why a dying woman had moved borrowed treatment money through Paul's company, while Judith said she would not allow me to turn her last Christmas into another interrogation. I said she was right and that everyone deserved to hear her own explanation without interruption, then connected the speaker to my phone and played the voicemail. The room remained still during the first minute because the sound was muffled and several people did not understand what they were hearing, but when Paul asked whether Emily had convinced me to sign the house papers, his face changed before anyone else reacted. And when Judith answered in her normal strong voice that Emily had finally stopped defending me, my wife lowered the pen without looking away from her mother. No one spoke while Judith described the condominium, fake invoices, non-existent biopsy, and planned to use our separation. And when the recording reached the part where she said the miscarriage had made Emily easier to control because grief kept her too frightened to question anything, Emily folded forward as if the words had struck her physically, and Sophie moved beside her without taking her eyes off Judith. When Judith laughed about fooling everyone with a gray cardigan and printed scans, then added that our lost child had solved the problem of Emily returning home too quickly, Luke stood so fast his chair struck the wall, Paul moved toward the speaker, and the quiet sound Emily made carried more rage than any shouting I had heard during the entire year. I told Paul not to touch the speaker, after which he said the audio was edited, illegal, and misunderstood, while Judith claimed she had been making a dark joke to cope with fear, even though the recording included account transfers, the condominium address, the exact amount they needed to move before year end, and a private cruelty no frightened patient could explain as confusion. I opened the folder and placed copies of the company registration, bank transfers, loan agreement, property records, and oncologist's statement on the table, then told the family that the original voicemail had been preserved, the accounts were being reviewed, and law enforcement already knew about the scheme. Emily asked her mother whether there had ever been cancer at all, and whether she had really used the miscarriage to keep us separated, and Judith looked around the room as if searching for a version of the truth that would leave at least one person beside her, then said doctors had once found an abnormal shadow, and she had only been trying to keep Emily from returning to a man who caused her stress. That answer ended whatever protection remained, because it was not yes, not no, and not the panic of an innocent person falsely accused of inventing a fatal disease, while the attempt to turn our child's death into another accusation against me finally showed Emily that her mother would use any loss, including one that belonged to her daughter, if it bought another minute of control. Paul tried to leave through the back door, but 2 officers met him in the driveway and asked him to remain while they served documents connected to the account freeze, while Judith stayed in her chair, alternating between rage and weakness so quickly that even relatives who had defended her for months stopped responding. There was no dramatic arrest at the dinner table, because criminal cases do not always move at the speed people expect, but officers collected Paul's phone under a warrant related to financial records, served preservation notices, and informed Judith that investigators would contact her attorney. The real collapse began after the officers left, when Emily asked how long I had known, and I told her 10 days, after which she slapped me once, covered her face, and said that everyone in her life had apparently decided what truth she could survive. Because her mother had built the lie, I had built the exposure, and neither of us had trusted her enough to let her choose how she learned either one. I did not blame her for that moment, although I also did not pretend the recording repaired anything, because she had spent months defending the person who drained our savings and used the miscarriage as leverage, while I had become so focused on preserving evidence that I trusted lawyers, detectives, and loan documents more than my own wife with the truth. Judith moved through denial, illness, and blame in that order, first calling the recording edited, then claiming stress had caused a real medical emergency, then saying Paul had transformed a harmless cyst into a scheme she never fully understood, but messages recovered from her tablet showed that she drafted treatment updates, corrected fake invoices, chose which relatives should receive which symptoms, and specifically told Paul that Emily's pregnancy loss made the separation easier to maintain. The cancer turned out to be a benign pancreatic cyst discovered during imaging for abdominal pain, something her doctor had recommended monitoring once a year, and she converted that ordinary follow-up into terminal illness after learning that Paul's retirement savings were smaller than he had claimed, and their planned Florida life required more money than either of them possessed. Paul blamed Judith as soon as the evidence became unavoidable, providing messages that proved the affair had lasted 6 years and that she proposed using our marriage problems to stop anyone from comparing records, while Judith insisted he created the invoices and controlled the transfers, which left two people who had once spoken about escaping together competing to prove who had been less dishonest. The civil case moved faster than the criminal one, so the condominium deposit was frozen, Paul's consulting account was restrained, and relatives filed claims through a shared attorney, while the $92,000 loan remained in Judith's name because the lender had verified her identity, delivered every disclosure, and sent the money exactly where she instructed, which meant the bank calls continued long after the scarf, the speeches, and the performance of dying had stopped working. I took no pleasure in watching her credit collapse because I knew I had allowed her to believe I would carry the debt. Yet I also knew she had signed without reading because she expected someone else to absorb whatever obligation stood between her and the money, and the loan became the first financial consequence she could not transfer to a daughter, a relative, or a public fundraiser. Emily and I did not reconcile simply because the truth appeared, since exposure stops the active lie, but does not return months of secrecy or a pregnancy that ended inside them. And by January, we were attending separate therapy while still sleeping in different rooms, trying to understand whether Judith had broken our marriage or merely found weaknesses we had spent years calling normal. Our therapist would not let either of us turn the miscarriage into a weapon, which meant Emily had to hear again that no doctor could prove stress caused the loss, while I had to accept that medical uncertainty did not erase the fact that Judith's calls, fabricated emergencies, financial demands, and deliberate pressure had filled nearly every day of that pregnancy with fear, and both truths remained painful without canceling each other. Luke was furious at everyone, including me for waiting, Emily for believing Judith, and himself for raising money at college, while Sophie developed panic whenever her phone rang because Judith had often called with supposed medical emergencies, and both children had to accept that the grandmother they tried to save had privately described their grief as useful. The extended family divided between people who wanted prosecution and people who believed Christmas humiliation was punishment enough, although most of those asking for mercy had lost less money, carried fewer lies into their marriages, and never sat beside Emily in a hospital after a miscarriage, while Judith quietly redirected the blame toward the person questioning her invoices. Judith eventually accepted a plea covering fraud, forgery, and theft by deception, which required restitution, several months in county custody, home confinement, and a ban on managing charitable funds, while Paul pleaded to related financial charges, lost the insurance consulting license he still used for occasional work, and sold his house to satisfy part of the judgment. Neither received the dramatic sentence some relatives expected, partly because they were older, had no prior convictions, and returned assets through the condominium freeze. But Judith also carried the treatment loan, tax problems, damage credit, and a restitution order that followed every legitimate dollar she received, so the comfortable Florida future she had planned became years of statements, collection notices, and supervised payments. The fundraiser created its own shame because strangers had donated after reading Sophie's public post, so we worked with investigators and the platform to return what could be traced, then sold a small rental property to cover part of the remaining difference. And although that decision delayed our recovery, it became one of the first choices Emily and I made together without hiding a transfer or asking Judith to explain what loyalty required. Later, Emily found a folder in Judith's cloud storage containing draft diagnosis announcements, lists of relatives with savings, notes about who responded better to fear than shame, and separate sections describing me as an obstacle who needed isolation and Emily as dependable when frightened, which hurt more than the affair because it showed that the habits her mother learned through decades of intimacy had been turned into a written plan. During sentencing, Judith said she never intended to hurt Emily, then added that mothers sometimes make desperate choices when their daughters marry controlling men, and Emily finally spoke without looking at me, telling the court that her mother had not only stolen money but had used a pregnancy, a miscarriage, and a daughter's fear of losing family as tools. After which, the judge reminded Judith that responsibility begins when a person stops making victims explain the offender's conduct. By the following Christmas, Emily had moved back into our bedroom, although trust returned through practical habits rather than speeches, including shared bank alerts, joint decisions, medical bills placed openly on the table, and a rule that no family emergency would ever again become a reason to hide information from each other. Judith wrote from custody and later from home confinement, first blaming Paul, then loneliness, then fear, and finally asking Emily to help with the loan because the bank had begun threatening collection, but Emily answered only once, saying that illness would have earned care, fear would have earned help, and an honest request for money would have earned discussion, while fraud had earned consequences that did not become cruel merely because they finally reached the person who created them. I still question the loan because I used Judith's greed and inattention against her after learning the truth. And although every signature was hers and every dollar went where she directed it, I cannot pretend the plan came from justice alone, just as I cannot pretend playing the recording before the whole family was the gentlest way to expose her. What I know is that private confrontation had always allowed Judith to divide people, alter details, and make every question look like disloyalty, while Christmas forced everyone to hear the same voice, see the same records, and understand at the same moment that the cancer, treatment, financial emergency, and concern for Emily's marriage had all belonged to one coordinated performance. We recovered a little over 60% of what Emily and I lost, but money no longer feels like the cleanest measure because we can rebuild savings while we cannot recover the child Emily carried, the months our children spent believing their father was heartless, or the part of a marriage that disappears when one partner begins reporting every disagreement to the person secretly engineering it. Emily still becomes quiet when someone mentions cancer or pregnancy, and she now volunteers with a patient transportation program because she needed to place something real where her mother created a performance, while I keep the voicemail in a legal archive and have never played it again because the sentence about the miscarriage remains clearer in my memory than any sound file could make it. My mother-in-law faked cancer, drained our savings, accepted money from relatives and strangers, maintained a secret relationship with the man helping move the funds, used our lost pregnancy to keep her daughter dependent, and nearly ended our marriage by teaching Emily that caution was cruelty. I found the recording, allowed Judith to borrow the final treatment money in her own name, and played her voice at Christmas dinner, but none of those choices felt like victory while I watched my wife understand that the mother she had tried to save had treated her fear, grief, and unborn child as parts of a financial plan. Even now, whenever a bank envelope arrives or Emily pauses outside a maternity ward, I remember that Judith converted two ordinary fears, debt and loss, into weapons, and I understand why exposing her felt necessary, even though the methods I chose still leave a taste of her own cruelty in my mouth long afterward. The truth gave us a way out, although it did not restore the past, and our marriage survived only after Emily and I stopped allowing another person to explain us to each other, accepted that grief can exist without a single medically provable cause, and learned that ordinary honesty is not harsh when the alternative is a lie strong enough to wear hospital paperwork, collect donations, purchase property, and sit at your Christmas table asking for one final sacrifice.